Hello and welcome to Beginning Synthesis on Free Software. This is episode 2, Filter and LFO. So far I've described to you a little bit about why I'm doing this series and what I hope that you can gain from following along. And we've started digging a little into the basics of subtractive synthesis, but we haven't actually reached the subtractive part of subtractive synthesis. That's to say, we've spoken about the oscillator, we've spoken about the amplifier, and we've spoken about the envelope. What we're going to talk about today is what makes a subtractive synthesizer subtractive, and that is the filter. So first, what is a filter? A filter is a device for removing harmonics from a sound. So harmonics are the elements that make up a sound that live at different pitches. These are commonly thought of as a series of sine waves which are at multiples of some fundamental pitch, which is the pitch of the note that you played. And the ratio and the volume of these harmonics defines what we call the timbre of the sound. So when we pick a saw wave, for example, that has a certain set of harmonics. In fact, it has every integer harmonic. A square wave only has the even-numbered harmonics. So they have different harmonic content, and therefore the filter will interact with them differently. Today I'm going to be using the legato line, and I'm going to have the synthesizer in legato mode. I described what that meant last episode, but it means that when the envelopes see overlapping notes, instead of restarting from the beginning, they are going to effectively stay open or stay where they are as though they single note continued to be held. So first, I've set an envelope shape. Let's just play and listen. So we can hear this very buzzy saw wave sound. Let's try a square wave just for some different sounds here. And now let's see what impact the filter has. So what are the controls on the filter? The controls on the filter are first velocity. This is how velocity sensitive the filter is, and I will go into some detail about what that means, but that's an important parameter for expression when playing. The next parameter up here is envelope amount. Remember that I mentioned there is an amplifier envelope. Well, there is a dedicated filter envelope which behaves just like the amplifier envelope, but instead of adjusting the gain on the amplifier, it is adjusting the frequency of the filter, which we shall get into. The next parameter is keyboard tracking. So you can imagine if a filter operates on a certain frequency, if I play higher pitched notes, more and more of that sound is going to be filtered out by the filter. So often what I want is, as I play a higher note, the frequency at which the filter operates would go up correspondingly. That's called keyboard tracking. The next parameter is gain. A gain is a volume control for the sum of the signals which come into the filter. On certain synthesizers, especially analog synthesizers, there can be distortion to the sound when the volume coming into the filter is loud. Certain synthesizers will model this distortion, so you can actually adjust the timbre by playing very loud into the filter and turning the amplifier gain down, or vice versa. So those are the parameters, but the core parameters, which you'll see on almost any filter, are the frequency, which is the pitch at which the filter functions, and resonance. So first, what does it mean to be a low-pass filter? A low-pass filter means that for any harmonic content below the frequency, the sound is going to pass through unaffected. Anything above that frequency is going to be attenuated. Well, how much is it going to be attenuated? That's what 24 means here. So 24 is telling you how many decibels the sound will be attenuated by per octave the pitch is above the filter cutoff. This sounds very complicated, but the thing to think about is the lower that number, the less aggressively it cuts off frequencies. So if that said low pass 600, it would cut almost any pitch, even the slightest bit above that cutoff off. If it said low pass 6, it would only slightly attenuate something just above the cutoff frequency. Let's understand this by listening more than anything, but let me explain the other parameters first. The other parameter here is resonance. So the filter has a cutoff. It cuts off at a certain point and it attenuates. Resonance is a form of feedback which actually accentuates the frequencies around the cutoff. So let's just play and let's listen. So I'm going to start the sound looping and I'm going to close the filter, as we call it. Closed means it's not letting any sound through. This is a term which sometimes confuses people because on a high pass filter, closing it means turning the frequency up, because a high pass filter lets things above the frequency, the cutoff frequency, go through. Low pass lets things below go through. So when I say close a filter, on a low pass I mean turn the frequency down. On a high pass I mean turn the frequency up. So you can see that I can turn it far enough that none of the harmonics get through. But let's listen to the character. So hopefully you can hear that as I sweep this filter, it's what we call animating the filter manually, more or less harmonic content gets through. The sound gets darker, it gets more round and soft. Now, the emphasis I mentioned called resonance. Let's turn some resonance up and let's turn this. I hope you can hear that sort of sound. That's the accentuated harmonic that I'm picking up. Now let me turn resonance all the way up. So hopefully you can hear that as I sweep that, because this sound only has certain harmonics, the resonance means that when I sweep the filter over a harmonic, I hear that harmonic, and then it gets attenuated, I hear the next one. The other option here is this thing called saturation. So remember when I spoke about gain on analog filters, driving and having some distortion? This saturation gives us that distortion. So as we use the filter envelope, which we will use, this is going to be where the sound starts, and the filter envelope can either move us below that point or above that point. What I think I'm going to do is have the filter envelope make the sound brighter and open, so I'm going to set this to some fairly dark point, but let's look at the other filters. So we have a 12 decibel per octave filter, so for the same cutoff, let's listen. You can hear that the 12 decibel per octave lets more harmonics through. Why? Because it doesn't attenuate those frequencies quite so aggressively. So now let's use the filter envelope. Let's first set the shape of the envelope. Maybe I'm going to go for a sort of plucky sound with a bit of sustain. So that's just the shape I've chosen. Now let's turn the envelope amount up. So you can hear the brightness come in when the note starts. Remember, this is legato, so where I have no rests and I have overlapping notes, the envelope stays in its sustained state. So let me turn the resonance on just so you can hear the movement of the filter more clearly. So you hopefully hear that. That's the filter closing. Let's add some attack and hopefully you'll hear it rising now. What? The filter rising. So you can hear we have some capacity to adjust these things. Now what I'm going to do is demonstrate one other feature. Remember I mentioned that we have this pulse width parameter. The pulse width indicating how narrow or wide the pulse wave is. What I'm going to introduce you to is a feature that is often not available on very basic synthesizers. It's called a modulation matrix. Remember I said that the amplifier envelope adjusts the amplifier, and we've just used the filter envelope and I adjust the envelope amount here to control the filter. These are called normal routings. These are routings which are always present and you don't need to do any, on a physical synthesizer, you don't need to patch any cables in, or you don't need to go in any menus to make these adjustments. On top of those, you have some capacity beyond the normal routing to make these things. And in a software synthesizer, that's usually a mod matrix. How does a mod matrix look? Typically, you have a source, meaning the modulation source. It might be one of the envelopes or something else. And then you have a modulation destination. In this case, you can have two destinations for each source. Additionally, you have an extra parameter here called scale. You can think of scale as allowing you to multiply two modulations together. A common use might be to have the velocity of the note that you play scale the envelope such that a hard note is going to have a full envelope motion and a very light note is going to have very small envelope motion. This gives you some expression, but it doesn't just have to be velocity. So let's look at one of these other devices. I guess I should introduce LFOs. What is an LFO? Well, we've spoken about the oscillator that makes sound. An LFO is another type of oscillator. Specifically, we call it a low frequency oscillator. When we say low frequency in this sense, we mean it is low enough frequency that if you played it as audio, you wouldn't be able to hear it. So typically that means below 20 hertz. Why do you want a very low frequency oscillator? Well, you can't use it for sound directly, but you can use it to adjust parameters. Now, one of the common things to do with a pulse wave is to animate the pulse width. Let's listen to what that sounds like by turning it manually. Hopefully you can hear there's that motion going there. So instead of me sitting here and manually animating that control, I can use the modulation matrix. I can select the source of LFO1, one of these low frequency oscillators. It's set to be a sine wave and it's set to some frequency. We'll experiment with that. And now we can pick a destination, and the destination will be the oscillator 1 pulse width. So what's going to happen is, as this LFO varies, it's going to be adjusting this pulse width. Now you won't see any animation on the interface, but you should be able to hear the effect. Let's play. So you don't hear anything. Why? Because I haven't set the amount. This parameter here is the amount. Sounds very strange. Why? Because at the moment the frequency is very high. 40 hertz, it's in the audio rate. Let's go way lower. Let's try adjusting the amount. So hopefully now you can hear that the LFO has allowed us to add some animation. And in the same way that there are different wave shapes for the oscillator with different timbres, there are different wave shapes for the LFOs. A saw wave is dropping and then ramping up. So you can hear a different sort of pulsing. A triangle wave is linearly moving up and down. So there are these stepped waveforms, there is this which is a randomized waveform. Let's move to a triangle wave for now. So I think this is just about all I wanted to discuss today. I've introduced to you the filter, the concept of a filter and what a filter does. We've introduced another envelope, which you'll see works just like the previous one, but in this case, it's normally routed to the cutoff of the filter. We've introduced an LFO and we've used that to animate the pulse width. This is known as pulse width modulation. So with this under our belt, I think we're getting the capacity to actually design some meaningful sounds. So next time, rather than just explaining the functions, I'm going to try and come in with a particular type of sound in mind, and we will explore the features and go through the process of designing a functional sound that you might actually use in your music. I hope that sounds interesting. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, but in any case, thank you very much for joining me today, and goodbye.